Hi, this is Pat Johnson, your psychology instructor, and in this mini lecture we're going to continue our discussion of memory and talk about the concepts of eyewitness testimony, Dr. Loftus's research, and source amnesia. Dr. Elizabeth Loftus is a researcher who's been around for quite a while. She has been doing research on just how malleable, in other words, just how much memories can be shaped by the suggestions of other people. And so one of her most famous studies is usually referred to as the smashed versus hit study. This was an experiment using experimental design, and in this study, all the subjects saw the same automobile accident. Then the subjects were randomly assigned into different groups. In your textbook, it shows this depiction of the smashed versus hit study, where all the people were shown the same car accident, and then some were asked how fast were the cars going when they smashed, and how fast were the cars going when they hit. The people who were who were cued with the word smashed remembered a much more violent automobile accident with glass and a higher rate of speed. So just that word smashed changed their memory. People who had seen the exact same automobile accident, but the word had been cued as how fast were the cars going when they hit, did not remember as high of a rate of speed and did not remember glass. Your textbook actually gives an abbreviated version of the original study. It wasn't just smashed versus hit. Dr. Loftus and her colleague Palmer used various groups, more than two groups, and one was asked how fast are the cars going when they smashed, how fast are the cars going when they collided, how fast were the cars going when they bumped, how fast were the cars going when they hit, how fast were they cars going when they contacted. So there were five different groups, and if you look at this axis of this table, the perceived miles per hour, the perceived speed, changed drastically depending on the intensity of the verb that was used to question the witnesses. And so Loftus's study shows just how much memory can be manipulated by a skilled investigator, by a skilled lawyer, by a person who wants to change that memory. Here's a famous quote by Dr. Loftus. In this picture, she's giving a talk on memory at a TED conference, so you can go to TED.com and listen to her talk about memory. But she says many people believe that memory works like a recording device. Memory works a little more like a Wikipedia page. You can go in there and change it, but so can other people. In other words, we, the public, like to think that memory is like a video camera, and it's not that way at all. All we remember is bits and pieces, and then we fill in the blanks with what makes sense to us or what information has been cued to us by other people. I also want to talk about the concept of source amnesia. And of course, amnesia means forgetting. And in this case, we're forgetting the source of the information. So we remember information, but we don't remember where we got it. And so this is somewhat similar to that concept of interference we talked about before. So our definition of source amnesia is not remembering correctly for how, when, or where information was learned or imagined. So let's say, for example, that I know I said something to a class, but I can't remember which class I told it to and which class I didn't. Well, I often have source amnesia about my different classes and what I told each of them because, for example, in a typical semester, I'm teaching Psych 150 Section HD1, Section HD2, Section HD3, Section MDAY1, Section HSAY1. And so all of these students tend to mush together, all these different sections. So what I have to do is keep notes with my lecture notes to say exactly what I went over with each different sections so that that source amnesia doesn't confuse what I teach the different classes. I've also had source amnesia from my different vacations. I like to hike. I specifically like to do climbing on granite walls and that type of thing. And I've done this in North Carolina, I've done this in Virginia, and I've done this in Maine. So often when I'm looking at pictures, I will remember doing that specific climb, but I won't remember where it is. So I will have source amnesia of exactly what vacation it was on, what year, and where it was done. The last topic I want to talk about is children as eyewitnesses. So we know that eyewitness testimony isn't that great. We saw that with Dr. Loftus's study, and we also know that from real world examples. In the 1980s and 1990s, throughout the United States, there were numerous very famous cases of daycare center abuse. And obviously, there can be abuse at daycare centers, and horrific things can be done to children. But in the 1980s and 1990s, there were numerous high profile cases where techniques for investigation and questioning of children as eyewitnesses were used that ended up not being very good techniques, and various things that people were accused of probably didn't happen, and the memories of the children were a result of bad investigation. One of the schools was the McMartin Preschool. You can go on Google and take a look at that. There was another one here in North Carolina at the Little Rascals Daycare Center. There's some very famous ones, and in one particular one, it was absolutely horrible because the daycare workers, the family who were involved, actually did not abuse the children but were put away for almost 2 decades. And it was proved later that it was not good investigative techniques. And even the children testified later as older teenagers saying, no, this didn't occur. It was the suggestions of the investigator. Two researchers, Cece and Bruck, were doing some of the groundbreaking research in children as eyewitnesses, and their research was instrumental in helping understand how eyewitness testimony from children could be manipulated and was probably not accurate. They used anatomically correct dolls. They would give the children the dolls, and the children would play with the dolls, and the more they played with the dolls, the more bizarre their stories became as far as what happened in the scenario that CC and Bruck had set up, where a doctor did a normal examination. I'll give a link to the research and show just what they did. You can also read about this in your textbook. But basically, CC and Bruck found that the younger the child, the less accurate their eyewitness testimony. And we know that that explicit long-term memory is just not fully formed. The hippocampus isn't fully developed. Children don't have language at very young ages, and so it's not as accurate of forming long-term memories. Also, the more suggestive the interviewer, if the interviewer says, all the other children saw this, didn't you? Those are very poor techniques to use when interviewing anyone, and especially children. So the more likely the interviewer used those type of techniques, the younger the child, the more likely children will not have accurate memories of incidents.